Hi guys, it has been a while since I posted. In my last video, I mentioned that we were in the process of house hunting and we found a house. We are closing on it in a couple of weeks. That has thrown everything into disarray. But I did want to get a tutorial out today on how to bind a quilt with minky backing. My latest pattern is called the Sweater Quilt. And this came about because I started with a Christmas kind of sweater feeling is what I wanted to accomplish. And then I realized, wait a second, I love Halloween patterns and fall patterns and all the seasonal quilts. So then I decided to make it so that this current version shows any sweater and it can be made for any season. I love the way it turned out. It's by far my favorite pattern. But of course, the first version I made is still Christmas. I love Christmas quilts. I've made more Christmas quilts than any other kind of quilt. The Christmas fabric that I chose this time is Christmas Adventures by Bev McCullough for Riley Blake Designs. Now, let me talk about this line because I tend to stay in the muted tones, in the saturated colors, in the darker areas of color. My husband saw this and he said, whoa, those are kind of bright for you, right? And they were, but I just knew that this line was gonna make a perfect quilt. My kids love brighter colors like my husband. And then I saw this line and I loved the little ornament baubles, the cute little bicycles, the Argyle sweater print that I used for the stripes. It's perfect. I love the line. I knew it would make a quilt and I knew it would make a fantastic sweater quilt. I wasn't disappointed. I love this version so much and it's going to be a great addition to all the quilts I pull out every year and the kids will love it. They will especially love that it has a minky backing. It is the coziest kind of backing you can do. Because I live in the Midwest, it's cold about 7 months out of the year. So we tend to always use our quilts when it's really cold out. And that extra warmth and loft from the minky, especially the Luxe Cuddle minky, which has a longer nap that I used for this quilt, it's really warm and it's got a fantastic weight. You put it on your shoulders, you put it on your lap, it just feels good. The number one question I get is, do I use a batting with a minky backing? Yes. I can't really speak to not using a batting because I've always done it and I've never had problems. It gives it great stability, even more warmth, and it's just overall been a fantastic experience. I have quilted minky on my domestic machine here and I have sent it out to long armors. It has come out perfect every time. And the great thing about minky, and even with the Luxe Cuddle and the longer nap, is that you still get that texture in the back. I was afraid when I first started using minky that you wouldn't see the quilting, but it's kind of on the contrary because you not only see the quilting, you really see the details. Now with the longer nap Luxe Cuddle, you don't see the fine details, but you get the overall pattern, which I really love still because it's got this subtle texture on the back that is intriguing and makes you want to turn the quilt over and see what's on the front. That said, there are some tips and tricks that I have learned while working with minky. Later on this year, I'm probably going to do a full tutorial on how to quilt minky, how I do it on my domestic, but today's video is going to be about binding a minky quilt. It does have that extra thickness, so there are some things that I have learned that make it work better, and the number one thing is just going slow. So come quilt with me and I will show you. Here's a look at the quilt before I have it trimmed. I love this pattern. I love this fabric. It is just stunning. When you zoom in here, let me get close. My favorite fabric in the whole line, I think, are the Christmas lights and the ornaments. How cute are those? This is what drew me to this line because I have not seen such cute Christmas lights. And then I mentioned the Argyle. Look at that. It's a classic sweater print. I mean, this fabric was screaming to be made into the sweater quilt. And then we have a classic argyle in Christmas colors. I absolutely love how Bev combined red and green with the pastels. And the fun thing about this line are the touches of gold that she used throughout. You can see here, there's gold surrounding the ornaments, and look at that little bicycle, I love that. And then there is gold flecks here in these snowflakes throughout. So I use that in this row and in the top row. So I love the gold that kind of unites the entire line. The quilting here was done by a local long armer. It's Lynn. She can be found on Instagram at Lynn Sews and Quilts, and she's super talented. Look at the quilting on here. Now, this fabric is kind of busy, so it's harder to see, but snowflakes, look at that. She did snowflakes all the way across this line, this whole entire row. And then here, she did an argyle. You can see the thread, argyle all the way across the argyle print. I love that. Another detail, she quilted each of these 4 patches all the way around. It gives it extra definition. And then here on the Christmas lights, there are little Christmas lights. Look at that, you can see them. The details on this quilt make it super fun. And this is one of those quilts that when I wash it, it's gonna have that much more definition. Here's more argyles, because when you wash it, it's gonna have that crinkle. And I think the puckering and the crinkling, not puckering, I should say crinkling, will really show off the quilting design. Here's the backing. You know, you can't see like the super defined pattern, you know, of the lights or the snowflakes, but you get the overall pattern. You get the idea that there is something there, and it ends up looking, you know, like a sweater all the way across, just like how I wanted it to. So the thing about binding with a minky is that it can make a mess when you are cutting minky because of the nap. You can see here's the longer nap right there. And it's in this nice woven mesh, but when you cut it, what's on the end kind of tends to come out. What I have learned is to have a vacuum nearby, handheld vacuum. So I trim about a foot at a time, and then I take my vacuum and I just vacuum along the edge of the one that I cut, and then right here, so I get all the fuzz. And if you do that throughout the entire trimming process, no mess. I picked up this trick when I used to buy minky at my local shop. They always had a handheld vacuum right next to them. When All right, there it is. It's all done. I have the pile on the floor. Everything is trimmed. It is ready to go. I am gonna go ahead and choose a binding. So you guys want to talk about perfect binding by accident? This stripe I picked up at my local shop, and this is what I was talking about, my pre-made binding stash. I got these binding spools from Sweater Quilt. You can see it right there. Her Etsy shop. These are awesome. I make the binding and then I just wrap them on here, and I have a whole bowl full of binding. But I saw this stripe at my local quilt shop. I had no idea what I would use it for. I just thought, I've never seen the wide stripe. I love it. And I loved the polka dots. I also really loved the color combinations. And look, it's perfect. There's red, there's pink, there's navy, there's a blue. It goes with this without even being from the same line. It's another Riley Blake design. It is by Heidi Staples of Fabric Mutt. I am loving this combination. This is gonna be the binding. It is super fun. When I sew a binding on, sometimes I sew it on the back and then I top stitch it on the front right here. And then sometimes I will sew it on the front and then top stitch it on the back by folding it over. And it, honestly, I change it up every time. I feel like it depends on the quilt for me. If you top stitch on the front, you have more control of where that stitching goes, and then there's no line. It's just the stitching, like there's no thread line because you're attaching it on the back, and you don't see that assembly line because you're folding it over on top, and you have more control. But then you do see, you know, to an extent, the top stitch line on the binding. If you sew it on, if you attach the binding on the front and then fold it back here, I do think that you get a thinner strip binding showing, like a thinner slice of the binding. It looks a little more modern, a little bit more clean maybe. But on the flip side, if you machine bind the whole thing, you're gonna have to turn it over and top stitch here. So when you do that, you actually will get the top stitch line will show through, and it's usually just below the binding all the way around. So it kind of depends. It's personal preference. I know a lot of the modern quilters will always attach it on the front and then fold it back and top stitch on the back, and they just get that clean look of the binding, and you know, you don't really notice the line. But it's personal preference. For some people, that line all the way across would bother them, and then for others, attaching on the back and folding over the front and top stitching here on the binding, that would bother them. So for me, it just depends on the quilt. With a minky, I tend to attach it on the back and then top stitch it on the front. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do for this quilt. When I start my binding, I'm just going to make sure that I'm lining up 1/4 of an inch on the edge. With a minky backing, this can be a little tricky because you have the nap, and so if it's folded over and you think that that's the 1/4 of an inch, you won't catch this actual mesh part, which is the material you want to sew with, or sew into rather. So I just kind of make sure that I'm catching the 1/4 of an inch on the edge of the mesh and not just the nap. If it goes over, you know, and I still know that I'm catching it, that's fine, because when I flip the quilt over, I can easily just tuck that extra long nap part in. And then when sewing a binding on a minky backing, I actually lengthen my stitch a little bit. My machine is a default 1.8 when I do a 1/4 inch. That's kind of the piecing default. I will move it to at least a 2.2 because this is so thick. I think the machine is a little bit of a hard time pulling it through. And to make this really easy, a walking foot is really handy. But today I'm just being lazy and going with it, and I just make sure to go slow, and I'm helping the machine kind of move it through because it has so much weight to this. And I'm just going to keep making sure that I have this on the 1/4 of an inch. I have done a stripe binding tutorial on how to make it so that you join your stripes so that the stripes are horizontal, and how to match up your stripes. I will put that link in the description. I have not, however, done a full tutorial on a binding, so that's what this is kind of going to show, the basics of binding, and then the tricks, of course, that I've learned with Minky. But this would apply toward any time you do a binding on a quilt. Although when I do flannel or regular backings, I tend to go a little bit faster. I think the thing that people struggle with most on a binding is getting the perfect mitered corners. It took me a long time to get that, and there weren't a lot of binding tutorials that kind of showed the nitty-gritty details how to get those. Eventually I figured it out, and Jenny from Missouri Star Quilt Company does do a binding tutorial. It's one of their older videos, but I have gotten better with every binding that I have done. And a minky binding is kind of the same as any other when you're getting the corners. Now the trick here is to sew down the edge until you get a 1/4 of an inch from this corner. So I'm going slow. With the minky, I'm always checking where's my actual fabric end, right there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and continue to sew until I can see about a 1/4 of an inch. I can even just do one more stitch. Okay, and then I'm going to take it, I'm going to raise my presser foot, I'm going to turn it so that it's diagonal, and I'm going to sew to the corner with my material, with my binding right there. Okay, so I sewed diagonal off of that, and then I'm going to turn it back this way. I have the diagonal, and here's the tricky part. This is what gets you the mitered corners. That diagonal kind of serves as an anchoring point. I'm going to fold back like that on the diagonal where I just stitched. See that? It's folded back. I'm trying to do this because I'm left-handed. Okay, I'm going to fold it back like that, and then I fold it down. After I fold it diagonal, I fold it down. When I'm folding it down in the diagonal, I want to make sure that I'm creating a straight edge here so that that lines up. And when I sew down, I want to make sure that this edge lines up. I'm going to turn my quilt, line it up with my presser foot, and then start sewing down just normal. Straight edge, not diagonal when you turn it and you sew it. So I'm going to go ahead and continue down here, and then I just keep sewing along the edge. Okay, I'm going to show one more time here. I've gotten to this corner. I am going to make sure that I sew just a 1/4 of an inch from the end of the mesh material, or if you're using regular backing like fabric, so you're just sewing a 1/4 of an inch to the end, and then you're going to turn it on the diagonal and sew off. So I'm almost there here. I go real slow, just a stitch at a time, very careful, and then I'm going to turn it. I kind of just turn it where I see it's diagonal, and then I just sew straight. That's it. I lift my presser foot, I turn my quilt, and that is going to serve as a position marker for me to fold my binding. So I have sewn there. I fold on the diagonal where it was sewn, and then I am going to make sure it's straight on this side. I turn it, lower my presser foot, line it up with my 1/4 of an inch, and sew straight on. That does get a little bulky, so that is especially a spot where you might have to just kind of help it through a little bit. And then I just go ahead and straighten it out here, and I'm going to continue sewing on down the side. I think one of the most difficult parts about binding a quilt for me was learning how to finish the binding. So when you start a quilt, you can do 5 to 10 inches. 10 inches gives you more fabric to work with. As you get better, you need less. So with this one, I did probably about 5 on the short end before I started to sew right here. And then I always stop about 10 inches, maybe a foot or more. Again, it just gives you more slack to work with. So the key to getting it even when you attach them, you're going to want to attach them just like you did when you made your binding. You're going to do it on the bias at a diagonal. I stretch this out, and then I move this. I'm doing this one-handed, so it's a little difficult, but you're going to put this over it, and you're going to want to cut 2.5 inches in my case, because that's how thick this binding is. So however thick your binding is, you are going to cut right there, overlapping from where this one is laid taut. Without having to get a ruler, I just usually grab the end and I'll open it up, and then I will lay it, and that kind of serves as a measurement. So I pull this part taut, use this as a measurement, and then I snip it. All right, I went ahead and I snipped it. It's perfect 2.5 inches. Then I'm going to open them up, and I'm going to make a cross just like I did when I made the binding, and then I'll lay them over and sew diagonal to diagonal. I used the shorter part of the binding for the bottom, and then I open up the top part and lay it over, and then I'm going to sew diagonal to diagonal from here to here. You just want to make sure that you aren't twisting the binding when they are sewn. So often what I'll do is hold my hand and then see like, oh, okay, when I close it, is it going to work? Yes, it will. And then I sew. Here's what it looks like all sewn together. Before I clip it, I kind of just go ahead and stretch it out and make sure that it looks good and is right. There we go. Perfect. So then I will go ahead and just trim this. Again, I'm doing this one-handed here because I was trying to get a better angle, but I will pull this taut and make sure that it lies nice and flat. That is the key. You know, sometimes you don't get it right if things have kind of shifted. It's very important to make sure that they don't shift, but it happens. And what would happen if you trimmed it that way and sewed it is you just might get a little pucker here. Sometimes I've been lazy with it, and then I kind of don't measure, I just eyeball it, and I'm off. So then I will need to rip it, and I've had to do that before. I used to, even when I was trying to get it correct, have to rip it pretty consistently in the very beginning before I really figured out how to lay it out, how to make sure it's taut, and it's just kind of a thing that's practice. But using these steps and then making sure you are perfect, which I hate to say because it's never really perfect, but at least close to it will ensure that it's flat. And you know what? Even to this day, sometimes I end up with a pucker on my binding, and it is what it is. It happens. Finished is better than perfect. Just take your time. This is a part of quilting where I do tend to go slower because it can be easy to mess up this last part. I went ahead and trimmed it, and I do 1/4 inch, just like all things quilting. When I made the binding, I did it 1/4 inch, and then I'm going to go ahead and finger press this open because it allows it to lay flatter. The reason why we attach on a bias seam with binding is because it spreads out the seam. So when I fold it this way, I have part of the seam here and part of the seam like up here. If you were to attach it horizontally like this, you would have both sides in one spot. So it just gives it a little bit of bulk, and in quilting we like to make things lie as flat as possible. The bias seam helps with that. Okay, I've put this in my machine. I have sewn down probably about 1 inch, but I wanted to show, see how when I pull it taut, it has no gap. It's nice and flat. Now look, this is off a little bit. Doesn't bother me because it's going to be hidden in the seam and it will be fine. Now, sometimes when attaching, you can see this isn't like perfect, right? But that's not gonna bother me. It depends on your personality. I have seen some people really try to match up the stripe exactly. Mine's a little off. You might see a little bit on the other side. That's okay for me. So I'm going to go ahead and continue sewing down 1/4 inch until I get to this seam where we started it at the very beginning. I wanted to show I ended up with just the tiniest of puckers right here, but it actually won't show when I fold it over. It will just lay nice and flat. So again, when you are sewing this, you can kind of finagle where it goes. This was just a slight bit that wasn't even from the very top part, and it wasn't on the underneath side. That was nice and flat. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and top stitch the top of the binding down. I just flipped the quilt over. You fold it. You want to make sure you're tucking all little stray threads. You can go through and trim them if you like, but I find it's not necessary because you can just make sure they're tucked in. And then the key with this part is just going slow, because then you want to get as close as you can to the edge so that it is securely fastened. If you were to sew like an 1/8 off or 1/16 here, I mean a 1/4 inch, this part, this little end is going to stick up. It just doesn't look as nice. So I try to sew along this edge as close as I can, and then I just fold over and do a little bit at a time. I always try to match the top thread to the binding. So I'm using white today, but I don't always use white. In my fall version of this, I did an orange top thread, or like a yellow orange top thread, because that is what matched the binding. If you want it to kind of disappear, I'll do that. And then with a stripe binding in particular, because you obviously have a lot more stripe going on, you got to decide which is the color. Like I did a binding with this piece, and I used not a white, I used the brownish kind of gold here, and it hid just fine. So I'm just going to continue sewing all along the edge, making sure I tuck any threads in. And you don't want to pull your binding too tight. Sometimes when I first started quilting, my bindings were crazy because I didn't know how to bind. I couldn't find a tutorial, and this was like, I don't know, almost 10 years ago now, I think. I would take the whole thing and fold it over like that. So there was no binding in the back, and this was super, super thick. So you don't want to do that. You're just taking it and folding your binding down and around. You still have binding in the back that acts as a frame, and then you just have it in the front. They do sell binding clips that you can clip all the way along. Some people really prefer them. It helps to keep it straight, but I also feel like it just takes a lot of time and it's an extra step. So I just hold a little bit and go through. I am nearing the corner here. You'll remember we did our miter corner on the reverse side. So sometimes you just get stray threads, pull them out, So here's what we do. I always decide which corner is going to fold up, and I'm just going to do the right hand side. So when you get to the corner, you know, everything is flipped like that as you're sewing. I flip it over, I pull it to the front, I'm going to fold it down like this, and then this is going to be at an angle. See how I get that miter right there? I'll show you that again. So it's like this. I'm nearing the end. I leave probably about 3 to 4 inches. I'm going to flip it over. You decide which side you want it to be on top. I'm going to fold that down. It kind of creates this little corner right there. See that? I'm going to take that, and that is what becomes, this part right here is what becomes the miter. Like that. And I kind of just fold it until I get it, because you can mess it up, right? You could pull it straight down, then it's not mitered. You want to just fold it, fold this part down until you get that nice mitered joint. There. It's like I had it perfect and then I let it go. So now it's mitered. I hold it with my finger and I continue to go. So like there's another stray thread. I'll have to trim that afterwards. You're going to continue to sew down. Still sticking to the end. And then I hold the miter just until, and I sew like a stitch over it. I'm going to raise my presser foot, turn my quilt around, and now I'm going to do the same thing. Be careful to tuck all my things, all my stray threads in. And this is the part where it is a little thick, especially with Minky, so I can kind of just help it get those first few stitches in. I've turned the corner, and now I'm going to continue to sew down this edge until I get to the next corner. I'm at the next corner, so I wanted to go ahead and show again. I'm going to decide which side I want up. Since I did that side, the right side, I'm going to do the same one here, because then the miters all look exactly the same. It was like this, folded back. I fold it over. I'm going to straighten this side first, fold that, tuck, there's the miter. So I'm just going to hold it here, keep going, sew to the end, and I just hold the miter all the way until the presser foot, and then now it'll hold it. I sew one stitch over the corner of the miter, and then I turn it, presser foot down. This part's a little thick, so I can just kind of help it through. There you go. And I continue to sew it down. Meet you back here when it's done. All right, there you go, guys. The binding is done. It looks so cute with this entire quilt. I'm going to spread it out and show you. Using the floor here as a design area, but look at that. How sweet is this binding? It ended up just being such a perfect match, even though I did not specifically buy this binding for the quilt, but it frames it just really well. The Minky gives it the extra loft. Let me go ahead and show you how the back looks. Still nice and slim. This is what the mitered corners will give you. It gives you this nice tuck in the back. And then this is the line that I was showing you when you machine bind and attach on the front and then flip it over and top sew here. this is the line that appears on the front of the quilt rather than the rear. So it, like I said, it just depends on the quilt. Sometimes I prefer to do it this way because this is a little bit thinner. You can see this binding on the front is a little bit thicker. This one is just a little thinner. So for me, it depends on the quilt. Sometimes I want a thin frame and sometimes I want a little bit thicker. If you were to cut your binding a little bit thinner, I do mine 2.25 inches. If you did 2 1/4, it would probably yield that thin look all around, but I prefer mine 2.5. I might try a 2 1/4 at some point and just to see the difference, how it would look. But this is such a fun quilt. I'm super excited that I went out of my comfort zone with fabric and tried this line. It is absolutely adorable. Again, it is called Christmas Adventures by Bev McCullough of Flamingo Toes for Riley Blake Designs, and it is in shops and available now. The sweater quilt is also available. I will put the link in my description. It is in my Etsy shop. It's just going to be such a fun quilt. All the versions of my testers have turned out amazing, and we are doing a quilt along September through October, which will have a ton of fun prizes. And the grand prize will be an edge-to-edge quilting by Lynn, who did the beautiful long arming on this job, and the prizes are going to be pretty awesome. I'm very excited to talk about that as we get closer to it. Thanks guys, and have a good day.